Hey class, so I want to start digging into the Euthyphro today, but strangely enough, I'm going to begin it not by talking about the Euthyphro, but by talking about the Iliad, Homer's great poem of the Trojan War. I think beginning with the Iliad is helpful for a couple of reasons. One, this is the book more than any other book, or the story more than any other story, that sort of guided the consciousness of your average or even above average Athenian. Like, it would not be unusual for an Athenian to have entire passages of the book memorized. So I want to begin with is just the opening couple lines, well, about maybe the opening 15 lines of the Iliad. So I'll read them to you. Rage, goddess, sing the rage of Peleus' son Achilles, murderous, doomed, that cost the Achaeans thousands of losses, hurling down to the house of death so many sturdy souls, great fighters' souls, but made their bodies carrion, feast for the dogs and birds. For the will of Zeus was moving towards its end. Begin, muse, when the first two broke and clashed, Agamemnon, lord of men, and brilliant Achilles. What god drove them to fight with such fury? Apollo, the son of Zeus and Leto. Incensed at the king, he swept a fatal plague through the army. Men were dying, and all because Agamemnon spurned Apollo's priest. And I'll stop there. So, the opening word of the poem is rage, and that actually describes the overall theme of the Iliad, which is the rage of Achilles, but that's not what we're going to talk about for the next few minutes. Instead, we're going to talk about the last few lines that I read to you. Homer says this, right? What god drove them to fight with such a fury? Because Agamemnon and Achilles are ostensibly on the same side. So why are they fighting? Because Apollo, the son of Zeus and Leto, incensed at the king, he swept a fatal plague through the army. Men were dying. All because Agamemnon spurned Apollo's priest. So we have a plague, right? The Greek army is sick and dying. They're all diseased. And this plague happened because the god Apollo was upset with Agamemnon. What's important for our purposes is the way in which the gods respond to perceived human offenses. Apollo does not merely punish Agamemnon, but punishes the entire army by sending a plague upon it. Right? So there's a kind of a collective punishment idea in the gods. And this idea of like sort of collective punishment from the gods is something that we'll see again and again in Homer. In fact, the whole story of the Trojan War is in a way collective punishment. This brings us to Euthyphro's motivation. Right? Euthyphro is bringing his father to trial for murder. And when Socrates questions Euthyphro as to why he is doing this, Euthyphro begins to talk about pollution, right? That it's his duty to do this because he has to avoid pollution. And the father, Euthyphro says, is polluted because he committed murder. And so Euthyphro's position is, my father murdered someone, and therefore he is disfavored by the gods because he committed this crime. Anyone who eats with him, sits with him, talks with him, walks with him, that enters into community with him, will also be disfavored by the gods. They will also be polluted. Ultimately, the whole city will be polluted if we just allow my father to walk around a free man having committed this murder. And the reason why this is so important goes back to what we saw in the opening sections of the Iliad. When the gods are displeased with you, they might send a plague on the city. They might destroy your city. For Euthyphro, he sees this trial that he's putting his father on as a defense of the city against the possible ramifications of allowing a polluted person to walk around. And it's important to sort of wrap your heads around this, because one of the points that this leads us to is the way the ancient Greeks thought about religion, or as they put it in the text, piety. That for 21st century, people, we tend to think of piety one's relationship with God, or in the ancient Greeks' case, the gods, as a private matter, right? That's between me and God. It's none of your business. That is absolutely not how the ancient Greeks thought about it. Because the gods will send plagues on the city if they're upset with you, and because they will punish, hundreds, if not thousands of people to make a point to you, it is never a private matter between you and the gods. Religion in ancient Greece is always a public thing. What we call separation of church and state did not exist. Right? It was sort of just a interweaving of religion and politics from top to bottom. Right? Even the name of the city, Athens, is a reference to Athena. Right? This is Athena's city. How does this relate to Socrates? Well, when we look at Socrates, when we look at the text of the Euthyphro, when Euthyphro asks Socrates what's going on here, why are you waiting outside for the trial? Sorry, I'm looking over my book. If you look at 3b, Socrates says that, well, there are strange things to hear him tell it. He says, the person that's accusing Socrates, that I am a maker of gods, on the grounds that I create new gods while not believing in the old gods. And he has indicted me for their sake, as he puts it. So Socrates is being indicted for impiety, right? And part of what's behind the indictment is, at least in some cases, the fear that Socrates, not believing in the gods, believing in some new and different gods, might be polluting the city by his presence. He might be angering the gods. So Euthyphro is putting his father on trial. And again, Euthyphro is doing this because he claims it will sort of preserve the city from pollution. But most of the fellow citizens in the city think that Euthyphro is out of his mind, and that putting his father on trial is actually more impious than not. So in response to this, Euthyphro claims that these people don't know what they're talking about. Obviously, I am an expert on piety, and the people of the city should just listen to me. And so both trials, in their own way, concern questions of piety. Socrates is on trial because he is basically accused of being impious. Euthyphro is going to trial because he thinks it's the pious thing to do, despite what many people around him think. Once Euthyphro claims that he can sort of disregard the opinions of the multitudes, of the demos, because he has special knowledge of what piety is, Socrates asks him, well, what is piety? And the bulk of the dialogue is going to be about Socrates and Euthyphro discussing what piety is. And I'll address those arguments and those questions in another video. I want to focus on one part of their conversation to get an idea about why Socrates might be on trial from his own mouth. So, Euthyphro is explaining what he thinks piety and impiety is. And if you look at 5e and 6a, we have this passage where Euthyphro says, I say that it is pious to do what I am doing now, to prosecute the wrongdoer, be it about murder or temple robbery or anything else, whether the wrongdoer is your father or your mother or anyone else, and not to prosecute is impious. And observe, Socrates, that I can cite powerful evidence that the law is so. I have already said to others that such actions are right, not to favor the ungodly, whoever they are. These people themselves agree that Zeus is the best and most just of the gods. Yet they agree that he bound his father because he unjustly swallowed his sons, and that he in turn castrated his father for similar reasons. But they are angry with me because I am prosecuting my father for his wrongdoings. They contradict themselves in what they say about the gods and about me. Well, let me give you the background. This story that Euthyphro references about Zeus and his father, where they're eating children and castrating each other, this is all essentially a summary of sort of the Greek story of the origin of the gods, where Zeus is of the third generation of sort of gods. Right? Prior to the Olympian gods, you have the Titans, and before that you had Uranus, who's just like the sky god. And so the sky god gives birth to the Titans. But then Kronos, who's sort of the leader of the Titans, once he and a couple other Titans are born, right, he wants to make sure that there's no more Titans, so he castrates his father so that there'll be no more Titans. Right, because Kronos doesn't want any rivals. Then Kronos is worried that his children will do to him what he did to his father, so every time Kronos has a baby, or every time Kronos' wife has a baby, Kronos eats it, and obviously Kronos' wife gets tired of having all her children eaten by her husband, and so when Zeus is born, she hides him on an island until he can grow up. When Zeus is grown up, he attacks Kronos, defeats him in battle, and then sort of there's a happy ending to this disgusting story. He gets a knife and cuts open Kronos' stomach and pulls out all of his brothers and sisters that Kronos had eaten because, being Greek gods, they couldn't be digested, and those become like the first generation of Olympian gods. Euthyphro's point is that, look, if it's okay for Zeus to, do these things, then certainly it's okay for me to put my father on trial. Now, the interesting thing here is Socrates' response. He says, "Indeed, Euthyphro, this is the reason why I am a defendant in this case, because I find it hard to accept things like that being said about the gods, and it is likely to be the reason why I shall be told that I do wrong." Right? So Socrates is letting the mask slip for us a little bit when he says, "I don't believe these stories." Right? I don't believe that the gods act this way. Euthyphro says, "Oh, no. Right? These things are true, and I know it." So Socrates goes a little farther in talking about what he doesn't believe. He says, "Do you really believe that there is war among the gods, and terrible enmities and battles, and other such things as are told by the poets, and other sacred stories such as are embroidered by good writers, and by representations of which the robe of the goddess is adorned when it is carried up to the Acropolis? Are we to say these things are true, Euthyphro?" This is an important sort of giveaway for Socrates, right? It's sort of like, are we supposed to believe these things? These things sound crazy. The gods fight each other. The gods hate each other sometimes. The gods get along. They don't get along. All true in terms of Greek mythology, right? In the Iliad, fighting, but different gods are on different sides, right? Some gods support the Greeks, some gods support the Trojans, and they fight each other as the Greeks and Trojans are fighting each other on the shores of Troy. And Socrates says, are we supposed to believe this? This seems like nonsense. And then he specifically mentions something, and this will bring us sort of full circle back to something we talked about earlier, this robe that they put on the goddess that they carry up to the Acropolis, right? So in Athens, right, the city was dedicated to Athena. And so they had a giant statue of Athena in a big temple called the Parthenon. And every so often they would have a sort of a civic ceremony where the city would get together and parade to the Parthenon and put a robe on the statue of Athena. And on the statue of Athena, embroidered on the robe, would be all the sorts of like myths and stories that concern Athena or Athens. And this event was a central part of Athenian sort of political and religious life. It was like combining the 4th of July with Thanksgiving and Christmas and whatever other like religious holiday you want to pick, and like rolling them all together, right? It was sort of a public, civic, religious ritual that was thought to be very important for the well-being of Athens, because since Athens is Athena's city, they have to keep her happy most of all. When Socrates says that, or suggests that he doesn't really believe this, he is placing himself outside of the political community of Athens. That although he lives in the city of Athens, we can see that he's not really all in the way Athens wants their citizens to be all in. This leads us to the second concern. Put yourself in the position of one of these families whose young adult child is spending time with Socrates, talking to him about politics, ethics, and philosophy and things like that. Would you be concerned that Socrates is going to undermine the political, religious, civic education that you've given your son or daughter, because Socrates is sort of in the city, but not of the city. Socrates seems to almost be kind of this free rider, right, who takes all the benefits of being in Athens, but doesn't seem to really commit himself to the ideals of the Athenian way of life. And if that is the case, would you want someone like that going around educating your children? And that's one of the questions that's going to be central to the text that we'll read when we finish the Euthyphro, called the Apology. But for now, I just wanted to get through this brief introduction to the Euthyphro. In the next week or so, I'll make another video on the discussion of piety itself in the Euthyphro. So I'll talk to you all later.